Imagine stepping into a time machine and hitting the 1789 button. You're zapped back to a world bubbling with secrets, daring adventures, and moments that would make your history book jump off the shelf. Picture a castle with dungeons, brave heroes standing up to kings, and the birth of a nation that loves freedom. What if I told you that in just 1 year, the world spun on its heels and nothing was ever the same again? That year is 1789, and I'm here to unveil the jaw-dropping stories of people who changed the world. Buckle up, because we're about to dive into a year so wild, it's like the greatest movie you've never seen. But before we get moving, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon. In 1789, France was like a giant cake with all the layers uneven. Imagine a cake so big, but only a few people got the biggest slices with all the icing and cherries. That's kind of what France was like back then. At the top of this cake, we had the King and Queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. They lived in super fancy castles, wore glittery outfits, and probably never had to worry about their Netflix subscription running out because they were too busy throwing extravagant parties with the coolest 18th century games. Just below them, in the middle layer, were the people who worked in the church, called the Second Estate. They were like the school's principals, but for religion and society. They had lots of power, told people how to live their lives, and didn't have to pay taxes. Imagine having a cheat code for life. Then there's the bottom layer of our cake, where almost everyone else was squished. This was the Third Estate, and it was packed with all kinds of folks. The baker who woke up when it was still dark to make your croissants, the teachers who had to deal with chalk dust all day, and farmers who made sure there were veggies to eat. They did most of the work, but hardly got any say in the big decisions. Imagine doing all the chores at home, but never getting to pick what's for dinner. France's money jar was empty because they kept spending on things like wars they didn't need to be in, and parties that were a little too fancy. King Louis XVI thought, we need to fix this. So he called everyone to a big meeting named the Estates General, kind of like a massive family meeting where everyone's supposed to share ideas. But here's where it got tricky. Every group, or estate, got only one vote. That meant the Third Estate, even though it had tons of people, had the same say as the much smaller First and Second Estates. That's like if your whole class voted on a movie to watch, but each group of friends only got one vote, even if one group was way bigger. This setup was super unfair, and the Third Estate was not having it. They were on the edge of making a huge scene that would shake up the whole country. And that's how 1789 started brewing into a year of big changes, with whispers of revolution in the air. People were ready for a shake-up, dreaming of a France where the cake was shared a bit more evenly. Strap in, because we're diving into a story of bravery, big ideas, and the year that flipped the world on its head. 1789. So, after that big, unfair meeting called the Estates General didn't go as planned, the Third Estate, which was like the biggest group of all, started feeling really left out. They were like, hey, why don't we get a fair share of the say? Imagine if you were playing a game where the rules were made so you'd always lose. You'd want to change the game, right? That's exactly what the Third Estate decided to do. But when they tried to meet and talk things over, they found the doors locked. It was as if the university closed all doors on you when you had the most important test of the year. Not fair, right? So, what did they do? They didn't go home or give up. They found a nearby tennis court and said, "This is the perfect place." On that tennis court, they made a super important promise to each other, which we now call the tennis court oath. It was a promise with hundreds of people. They vowed not to stop until they had written a new set of rules for France, a constitution that would be fair and give everyone a voice. not just the fancy folks at the top. Imagine standing there on that tennis court, deciding to change your whole country's rules because you believed it wasn't fair. It was pretty brave. They were standing up for what they believed in, even though it was risky. They could get in big trouble for doing this, but they knew it was the right thing to do. This tennis court oath was a big deal because it was the first time in a long time that regular people stood up and said, "Enough is enough. We want to be heard." It was like lighting a spark that would eventually start a huge fire, the French Revolution. And guess what? They did get in trouble. The king wasn't happy at all. He was like a principal who found out the students were planning to change the school rules. But the cat was out of the bag, and there was no going back. This oath on a tennis court wasn't just a promise. It was the beginning of something huge. It showed everyone that when people come together, they can make big changes, even if it means starting on a tennis court. This moment, the tennis court oath, was like the first domino to fall in a long line of dominoes that would lead to some of the biggest changes France had ever seen. And it all started because a group of people believed in fairness and were brave enough to stand up for it. After the tennis court oath, things in France got really tense, like when you can tell a big storm is coming because the sky turns dark and the air feels different. Everyone was on edge, especially in Paris, the heart of France. Picture this: people whispering on every street corner, everyone wondering what would happen next. Then on July 14th, 1789, something huge happened. It was like the moment in a movie when everything explodes. This was the day of the storming of the Bastille. Now, you might be wondering, what's a Bastille? Well, imagine a giant fortress in the middle of the city with big walls and towers. But it wasn't just any fortress. It was a prison where the king could send people without a trial. Just like that, poof, they're gone. Pretty scary, right? People in Paris were really scared and angry about a lot of things, but the Bastille was a big symbol of all the unfairness. They were tired of the king and his rules, tired of not having enough bread to eat, and really tired of not being listened to. So, they decided to do something about it. On that day, a huge crowd of people, armed with whatever they could find, marched to the Bastille. They were determined to take over the prison, not just because they wanted to free the few prisoners inside, there weren't many, but because they wanted to show they were serious about changing things. It was like saying, "We're not afraid anymore. We want our voices to be heard." There were fights, and it was scary and dangerous, but by the end of the day, the people had taken over the Bastille. They even tore it down stone by stone, so it couldn't be used as a prison ever again. This was a big win for the regular folks, the Third Estate, and it sent a message all across France. Things needed to change. The storming of the Bastille was so important that today, July 14th, is celebrated in France like the 4th of July in the United States. It's a day of big parades and fireworks, all because of what happened back in 1789. So, why was the storming of the Bastille such a big deal? It showed that when people work together, they can fight against unfairness and win. It was the spark that really set the French Revolution on fire, and things in France would never be the same again. It's a story about bravery, about standing up for what's right, and about how even the biggest walls can be torn down when people come together. After the storming of the Bastille, things in France were like a pot that's been left on the stove too long and starts to boil over. People were both super excited because they had shown they could stand up to the king and super scared because, well, standing up to the king was a pretty big deal. This mix of feelings led to what's known as the Great Fear. Imagine a game of telephone where the message starts as, "I got a new puppy," but ends up as, a giant puppy is taking over the town. That's kind of what happened across France. It all started in the countryside, the big open spaces where most people were farmers. Rumors flew from village to village like wildfire. People heard that the king's soldiers were coming to attack them, take their crops, and burn down their homes. None of this was true, but in those days, there was no way to check Instagram or Twitter to get the real story. So, fear spread super fast. Farmers grabbed whatever tools they could, pitchforks, shovels, anything really, and formed groups to protect their villages. Some even attacked castles and homes of the nobles because they thought the nobles were behind all their problems. They wanted to make sure the nobles couldn't hurt them or make them pay unfair taxes anymore. This was a big mess. But here's the thing. The Great Fear actually helped the revolution. How? Well, it showed the nobles and the king that the people were really unhappy. It wasn't just a bunch of folks in Paris getting mad. It was everyone all over France saying, "We've had enough." During the Great Fear, something else important happened. The National Assembly, which was like a big group of people trying to make new rules for France, realized they had to do something fast to calm everyone down. So, they started making big changes. They said, "Okay, we hear you. Let's make things more fair for everyone." This was a start to giving more power to the people and less to the king and nobles. So, even though the Great Fear was a scary time, with lots of rumors and confusion, it helped push France towards big changes. It was like when you're playing a game and suddenly everyone decides to change the rules so the game is more fun for everybody. That's what the people of France were trying to do. Change the rules of the game so life would be better for everyone, not just the king and his friends. After the Great Fear, something amazing happened one night that changed France forever. It was like in a movie when the heroes decide to make a big, bold move to save the day. This happened on the night of August 4th, and it was a night that nobody in France would ever forget. So, what was so special about this night? The leaders of France, who were part of something called the National Assembly, think of it like a big team working to fix the country's problems, were having a meeting. They were talking about all the chaos and fear happening outside their windows, with peasants standing up for themselves and everyone feeling scared and uncertain about the future. Suddenly, one nobleman stood up and did something nobody expected. He said, "Let's get rid of all the old rules that make life so unfair for the peasants." It was like saying, "Let's hit the reset button and start all over." And then, one by one, other nobles and church leaders started saying they agreed. They decided to give up their special privileges, like not having to pay taxes and having the power to make peasants work for them for free. This might sound simple, but it was huge. Imagine if all the people who had been winning at a game for years suddenly said, "Let's change the rules so everyone has a fair chance." That's what it was like. They were giving up their power to make France a better place for everyone. By the end of the night, they had agreed to end all kinds of old rules that made life unfair. This was a big step toward freedom and equality in France, and it showed that even the people who had everything to lose were willing to help make things better. The night of August the 4th was a turning point. It was when the people in charge showed they were listening, and that they cared about making France fair. It gave everyone hope that change was possible, and that the revolution could lead to a better life for all. This night proved that when people come together and agree to make sacrifices, they can change the world. And that's exactly what they started to do in France. After the night of August 4th, where big changes started, something even more awesome happened. Imagine if there was a list that said everyone should be treated fairly, kind of like the rules of a game where no one cheats. That's what the National Assembly did on August 26, 1789. They came up with a super important document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It's a mouthful, but it's basically a list of top 10 hits for freedom and fairness. This declaration was like the rule book for a new France. It said all people are born free and stay free and equal in rights. That means no matter if you're rich, poor, or somewhere in between, everyone should be treated the same. It also said people should only be arrested if there's a good reason, and everyone has the right to say what they think, which was a big deal back then. Think of it like this. Before, the king could do whatever he wanted, and nobody could say, "That's not fair." But with this declaration, it was like everyone in France was given a shield saying, "You have to treat me right." It was the start of people having a say in how things were run, instead of just following orders from someone in a fancy hat. But why was this so important? Well, for hundreds of years, people weren't treated equally in France. If you weren't born into a fancy family, there were a lot of things you just couldn't do. This declaration was the first step in saying, hey, everyone deserves a chance to be happy and live a good life. It was a huge moment, not just for France, but for the whole world. Other countries looked at France and said, wow, that's a really cool idea. Maybe we should think about freedom and rights too. So, this wasn't just a piece of paper. It was like a spark that helped start fights for freedom in lots of other places. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen showed everyone that change was possible. It made people believe in a future where everyone could have a voice and a chance to make their lives better, and that's a pretty big deal, even today. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right and fair can really make a difference in the world. After the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen got everybody talking about freedom and fairness, something else big happened. This event was like the scene where everyone bands together for an epic journey. It's called the March on Versailles, and it happened on October 5th, 1789. Imagine this. Paris was buzzing like a hive full of bees. People were excited about change, but also really hungry. There wasn't enough bread, and what little there was, it was super expensive. Picture going to the store and finding out that a loaf of bread costs all the money you saved from your salary. That's how bad it was. So, what did the people do? They didn't just sit around complaining. A group of women, yes, women leading the way, decided they had enough. They were like superheroes of their day. These women, along with a bunch of other folks from Paris, said, "Let's go talk to the king. He needs to know we're starving and that we're serious about all those rights we were promised." And so, they set off on a march to Versailles, where the king lived in a huge, fancy palace. It was a long walk, about 12 miles, and it wasn't easy, but they were determined. When they got there, they didn't just ask nicely. They demanded the king to do something about the bread prices and to move back to Paris, where he could see the problems firsthand. King Louis XVI was pretty surprised to see all these angry but determined people at his doorstep. But he listened. He agreed to move back to Paris, and he took the women's demands seriously. This was a big deal because it showed that the king wasn't all powerful anymore. The people had a voice, and they could make big things happen when they worked together. The March on Versailles was important for a lot of reasons. It showed that regular people, even women who didn't have much power back then, could change the course of history. It brought the king closer to the people, literally, by making him move to Paris. And it proved that the spirit of the French Revolution wasn't just about fancy declarations or angry peasants in the countryside. It was about everyone in France wanting a better life and being willing to march, shout, and stand up for it. This march was like a scene where the underdogs band together, face the big boss, and come out stronger. It's a reminder that when people feel strongly about something, they can make amazing things happen, even if it means marching all the way to a king's palace to ask for bread and freedom. After the big march to Versailles, where people made the king listen to them, something really important happened. The king, queen, and their kids had to move back to Paris, the heart of all the action. It was like the people said, "If you're going to be king, you need to see how we live." So they all moved into a place called the Tuileries Palace. Imagine having to pack up your whole life because a bunch of angry but hopeful people wanted you closer to them. This move was a big deal because it showed that the king wasn't in his faraway castle anymore. He was right there, in the middle of Paris, where all the action was happening. It was like the people of France had their leader on a shorter leash. They wanted to make sure he could hear them, see them, and hopefully understand them better. Now, with the king in Paris, the National Assembly, which was like this new group trying to make fair rules for everyone, got busier. They were working on ideas to make France a better place where everyone had a say, not just the rich and powerful. This was their chance to really change things, with the king right there in the city. The streets of Paris were buzzing with excitement and ideas. People talked about freedom, fairness, and how everyone should have bread on their table. Cafes were full of people debating, planning, and dreaming of a new France. It was like the whole city was alive with the hope of change. This was also a bit scary for the king because he wasn't used to being so close to the people. He was more used to making decisions from his big, quiet castle in Versailles. But now, in Paris, he could hear the noises of the city, the marches and the calls for change right outside his window. Moving the king to Paris wasn't just about changing where he lived. It was about showing that the people wanted to be part of the decisions being made. They didn't want to be forgotten or ignored anymore. This move was a big step toward making France a place where everyone, no matter if they were rich or poor, had a voice in how the country was run. It was a time of hope, dreams, and a little bit of fear because nobody knew what would happen next. But one thing was clear: change was coming, and it was right at the doorstep of the Tuileries Palace. The adventure of reshaping France was just beginning, and everyone was invited to be part of it. After the Third Estate formed the National Assembly and showed they were serious about changing France, more things happened. This next part of our story is about when the National Assembly took a huge step, something like leveling up in a video game when you complete a major quest. The National Assembly knew that to really make things fair for everyone, they needed to write down the new rules. Not just any rules, but a constitution, kind of like a handbook for how the country should be run. Imagine if country didn't have any rules and suddenly a group of people got to decide on new ones. You'd want to make sure everything was fair, right? That's exactly what the National Assembly wanted to do for France. Writing a constitution was a big deal because, before this, the king could pretty much do whatever he wanted. But with a constitution, even the king would have to follow the rules. It was like the biggest, strongest player in the game couldn't cheat anymore. So, the National Assembly got to work. They looked at what was happening in other places, like the United States, which had recently written its own constitution. They wanted to make sure that the rights they had fought for, like being able to speak freely and not being thrown in jail without a good reason, were protected. They dreamed of a France where everyone had a say, not just the people with the most money or the fanciest titles. But writing the constitution wasn't easy. Imagine trying to agree on a group project where everyone has different ideas. That's what it was like for the National Assembly. There were lots of debates and arguments. Some people thought the king should still have a lot of power, while others wanted to make sure the people had more control. In the end, the constitution they came up with was a compromise, but it was still a huge step forward. It set up a system of government where there were different branches to make sure no one person or group could have too much power. It was like setting up a game where there were rules to make sure everyone got a turn and no one could dominate the whole time. The Constitution of 1791, as it came to be known, was like the blueprint for a new France. It was the result of all the marching, debating, and dreaming of the people who wanted a better future. And while it wasn't perfect, and there would be many more challenges ahead, it was a start. Let's zoom out a bit and look at something big happening across the ocean. This next part of our tale is about a country that was also going through a lot of changes, just like France. We're talking about the United States of America, and this chapter is called The First President. While France was in the middle of revolution and making big decisions, the United States had just finished its fight for independence from Britain. Now, they were ready to take a huge step, picking their very first president. This was a big deal, because it was like setting up the final piece in their brand new puzzle of a country. Enter George Washington, a name you have heard before. He was a big figure back then, known for being brave and leading the American soldiers during the Revolutionary War. After the war, everyone agreed there was no one better to become the first leader of this new nation. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington took an oath and became the first president of the United States right there in New York City, which was the capital at the time. Imagine standing in a crowd, watching as the very first president of your country is being sworn in. It was a moment of hope and excitement, thinking about all the possibilities that lay ahead. Washington becoming president wasn't just a big moment for America, it sent ripples across the world. It showed that after fighting for freedom, a country could start fresh, with leaders chosen by the people. Well, at least the people who were allowed to vote back then. It was about setting up a government where no king or queen had the final say, but rather the people and their elected leaders did. This event was super important because it kind of connected to what was happening in France. Both countries were experimenting with ideas of freedom, democracy, and how to make sure everyone had a say in their government. While France was having a more turbulent time figuring it out, America's first steps with Washington showed a path to a different kind of future. So, The First President isn't just a chapter about a man becoming a president. It's about the birth of a new way of thinking, about who gets to make the decisions in a country. It's a reminder that big changes involve big ideas, and sometimes those ideas start with a single step, or in this case, a single president. And just like in France, these changes were all about trying to make a better world for everyone. As we've journeyed through the tumultuous times of the French Revolution and witnessed the birth of the first president in the United States, our story now takes us to the high seas for an adventure that's just as riveting. This chapter, called Mutiny on the Bounty, is like a dramatic scene straight out of a pirate movie, except it's all true. Back in 1789, the same year George Washington became president, and France was in the throes of revolution, there was a ship named the HMS Bounty. It was on a mission to transport breadfruit plants from Tahiti to the West Indies. The captain of this ship was a man named William Bligh, and he had a crew that was about to make history in a way they never expected. Life on the Bounty was extremely tough. Imagine being stuck on a boat for months with the same people, eating the same food, and following strict rules set by a captain who didn't always seem fair. Tensions started to build like a soda bottle shaken too many times, ready to explode. And explode it did on April 28, 1789. a man named Fletcher Christian led a group of sailors in a mutiny, which is a fancy word for rebellion. They decided they had enough of Captain Bligh's strict ways and took over the ship. It was a bold and dangerous move. Mutinies were taken very seriously, and if caught, the punishment was super harsh. But why did they do it? Some say it was because life in Tahiti was like paradise compared to the strict and cramped conditions on the Bounty. Others say it was purely out of anger towards Captain Bligh's treatment of his crew. Whatever the reason, Fletcher Christian and his mutineers set Captain Bligh and those loyal to him adrift in a small boat and took control of the Bounty. Now here's where it gets even more movie-like. Captain Bligh, determined not to let this be the end of his story, navigated the tiny boat over 3,600 miles to safety with limited supplies. It's one of the most incredible survival stories ever. Meanwhile, the mutineers eventually settled on Pitcairn Island, a tiny dot in the Pacific Ocean, hoping to escape the British Navy. They burned the Bounty to hide their whereabouts and started new lives, but the story of their mutiny would live on forever. The mutiny on the Bounty isn't just a tale of rebellion on the high seas. It's a story about the human spirit, the desire for freedom, and the lengths people will go to find happiness. It reminds us that history isn't just made in the halls of power or on the battlefields, but can be made anywhere, even in the middle of the ocean. In the midst of all these massive changes, there emerge stories that remind us revolutions aren't just about battles and laws, but also about giving a voice to those who've been silenced. This chapter is called A Voice for the Voiceless, and it shines a spotlight on a remarkable figure whose story intertwined with the spirit of revolution, though in a different way. In the same era, when France and America were wrestling with their futures, a man named Olaudah Equiano was fighting a different kind of battle. He wasn't a soldier or a politician. He was a former slave who bought his own freedom and then decided the world needed to hear what slavery was really like. Imagine being so brave that after escaping a nightmare, instead of running away from it, you turn around and face it head-on, telling your story to help others. Equiano wrote a book about his life named The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, which was a big deal because back then, most people had no idea about the horrors of slavery. They didn't know about the chains, the ships, the fear, or the pain. Equiano's book opened their eyes. It was like he was giving a megaphone to all those who suffered in silence, letting their stories be heard through his words. His book didn't just make people sad or angry. It made them want to change things. Just like the French Revolution was about fighting for freedom and rights, Equiano's story inspired people to fight against slavery. It showed that words could be as powerful as swords, changing minds and laws. This chapter reminds us that revolutions come in many forms. Sometimes it's a giant crowd storming a fortress. Other times it's a single person with the courage to tell their truth. Equiano's voice helped spark a movement that would grow into a global battle against slavery, proving that even in times of great turmoil, there are always those who stand up for justice and humanity. His story is a beacon of hope and a testament to the power of sharing one's experiences to make the world a better place. It teaches us that no matter how small we might feel, everyone has the power to make a difference. Through his words, Equiano reached across oceans and centuries, touching hearts and minds, and reminding us that in the fight for a better world, everyone has a part to play. While revolutions stirred and people across the world fought for their rights, a different kind of revolution was quietly taking place in the United States. This chapter takes us to a groundbreaking moment in education. Just as voices were rising for freedom and equality, a bold step was taken to spread knowledge far and wide. In December 1789, Amidst the whirlwind of change, the University of North Carolina was chartered. Now, you might wonder, why is a university getting started such a big deal? Well, it was the first public university in the United States, which means it was created not just for the rich or the elite, but for everyone. Imagine a door opening up, a door to a room filled with all the books and knowledge in the world, and now it was open to anyone who wanted to learn, not just those who could afford it. The idea was revolutionary, because back then, education was a privilege, something only a few could access. The founders of this university believed that knowledge was a key to freedom, just as important as the rights people were fighting for in France or the independence Americans had won. They thought that by educating citizens, they were strengthening the very foundations of democracy. Creating the University of North Carolina was like planting a seed. From that seed, the idea grew that education should be available to all, not kept behind locked doors. It set a precedent, showing that learning and enlightenment were vital for the progress of a nation and the well-being of its people. This move towards public education was part of the larger shifts happening worldwide. Just as nations sought to redefine freedom and rights, this moment in education sought to redefine who gets to learn, who gets to explore new ideas, and who gets to dream of a better future. The first public university is a testament to the belief that knowledge is a right, not a privilege. It's a chapter about opening doors and minds, about a country not just declaring independence but living it by empowering its citizens with education. And just like the stories of revolutions and battles for rights, the story of the University of North Carolina is about laying the bricks for a future where everyone has a chance to reach for the stars. In 1789, while France was teetering on the brink of revolution and George Washington was taking the presidential oath in the United States, another significant event unfolded in the north of Europe. This was the year King Gustav III of Sweden initiated what is known as the Russo-Swedish War. This conflict, set against the backdrop of European power struggles, was not just a simple battle for territory, but a chess move in the complex game of 18th century politics and ambition. King Gustav III, known for his flair for the dramatic and a penchant for strengthening royal authority, aimed to reclaim territories lost to Russia in previous conflicts. These territories were not merely land for Gustav. They were symbols of Swedish prestige and power that had been diminishing over the years. The war began under the guise of liberating the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea from Russian dominance, a cause that Gustav believed would rally the Swedish people and solidify his reign. However, the war's outbreak was met with mixed reactions within Sweden. While some saw it as a chance to restore Sweden's status as a major European power, others viewed it skeptically, concerned about the costs and the king's motives. Gustav's decision to go to war with Russia, then under the rule of Catherine the Great, was a bold gamble. Russia was a formidable opponent with vast resources and a strong military. The Russo-Swedish War unfolded over several years, with battles fought on land and sea. Despite initial enthusiasm, the Swedish forces found themselves stretched thin, battling not just Russian troops, but also dealing with the logistical challenges of warfare in the harsh terrains of the Baltic region. The conflict showcased the era's military tactics and the evolving nature of 18th century warfare, with both sides experiencing victories and defeats. This war, while often overshadowed by the dramatic events of the French Revolution and the American struggle for independence, was a critical moment for Sweden. It tested the limits of monarchical power, the resilience of the Swedish people, and the strategic acumen of its leaders. The Russo-Swedish War ultimately shaped the future of the Baltic region and influenced the course of European politics. In retrospect, The conflict exemplifies the complexities of international relations and national ambition during a time when the map of Europe was frequently redrawn by wars and treaties. King Gustav III's war with Russia serves as a reminder of the volatile nature of historical change, where the aspirations of individuals can ignite conflicts with lasting repercussions beyond their immediate context. As we draw the curtains on our exploration of 1789, a year that reverberated through the corridors of time and shaped the course of human history, we are reminded of the indomitable spirit of humanity. From the streets of Paris to the solemn inauguration of George Washington, and across the seas to the tumultuous events, this year showcased the myriad ways in which the quest for freedom and justice manifested. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the past, a voyage that reminds us of the enduring power of ideas and the unquenchable thirst for justice that drives humanity forward. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon. Until our next historical adventure, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep the flame of curiosity alive. Remember, history is not just about the past, it's a guidepost for the future, offering invaluable lessons on how to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.